Thank you so much, Robert, for that very kind introduction. And thank you, Mark, for the invitation to come and speak to you at the event this year. I've been involved with the IOER for about 4 years now as a member of the advisory council for the graduate school. But due to a combination of COVID and such things, this is actually my first visit to Dresden. And I have to say it's absolutely fantastic to be here. And it was lovely to be involved with the graduate summer school yesterday and talk to the graduates here who are doing some absolutely wonderful, very, very interesting work. What I'm going to talk to today, transformative governance, experimenting, learning, changing, is really, I guess, an overview of some of the work I've been involved with over the last 10 years that started off trying to think about solutions and has ended up really thinking about implementing solutions and how we actually put things into practice. And I've already heard a number of talks on that topic already this morning. So I'm hoping this will resonate with some of you. So the talk's in 4 parts. We'll start with a very, very brief rehearsal of why we all talk about transformation and feel like we need transformation. I'm then going to say a little bit about this mode of governance, the experimental mode of governance, the rise of this idea we need to be experimenting and trying new things. And then really, I guess, the thing I want to focus on is this move that I feel we need to make from the focus on the experiment towards the focus on learning and what we do with that learning. And the final part of the talk will just give some reflections on what this might mean for transformation, how we talk about it. What are we actually talking about transforming in practice? So this obviously isn't news to anyone, but in terms of focusing on sustainable cities, I guess the 2 main trends we need to think about are the increasing urban population of the planet and the increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And these abatement curves, these mitigation curves, show that the longer we leave it without transforming, the more rapidly we're somehow going to have to transform. So with every year that goes past, this idea of transformation becomes increasingly urgent. How does it look for cities? Well, they feel like they're just being battered by one crisis after another. But over the last, I guess, 20 years, there's been a growing realization that actually cities can be the solutions to a lot of the challenges facing us. Certainly when you look through the UN Sustainable Development Goals, number 11 focuses specifically on cities, but many of the others are actually best addressed in urban contexts. It's where most people are situated. It's often where the problems are most acute. But because it has economies of scale, if we can change things to improve things, they will have the biggest impact the most quickly. And certainly that's what led me towards researching cities. Now, of course, we actually have quite a lot of solutions. We know we've got problems, but we actually have a number of the solutions. This picture on the left here is purposefully out of date. This is from a planning manual from the 1990s, last century. It's the last century. It's powerful, though. It shows the same number of people, this number of people here, and it shows how much space they take up in cars, and it shows how much space they take up in a bus, and it shows how much space they take up on bikes, and of course it shows how much space they actually take up if they're on foot. It's a powerful illustration of the extreme inefficiency of car-based transport in cities. We've known this for a long time. And yet, this kind of thing on the right is still being built today. I'm aware it's after lunch, by the way. I get to stand up and walk around, so I'm probably not going to fall asleep. But I don't know whether you lot are going to fall asleep, so I'm going to make it slightly interactive. Can anyone tell me where this is on the right? Which city are we in? Please feel free just to shout out. No need to raise a hand or anything. Go on, loud, shout loud. Nope, not LA. Nope.
Detroit?
Nope. Nope, just shout. Dubai. Yes, it's Dubai. Yes, it's Dubai. We're still building this kind of thing. The footprint of this roundabout is about the same size as the historical core of the city of Florence. There is no, you will notice there's no way to walk from this building to this building. It's not hard, it's impossible. There is no way to do it. We're still building this stuff. An example from closer to home that moves us towards some understanding of why. So this is something no one in Britain will ever have heard of this. It's an upgrade, roundabout upgrade, highways upgrade called the Black Cat Roundabout, which at rush hour will shave 7 minutes off a 90-minute journey into Cambridge. This thing is costing €1.5 billion right now. It's under construction. That is more than the entire hospital building budget for a year for the entire country of the UK. And yet public funds are being funneled into this based on logical, rational decision making with evidence going in. What are the priorities that are causing this kind of thing? And you talk to transport planners and they'll tell you, well, we value how many minutes of commuter time in a car are saved, and we value that at £2 a minute. And you say to them, how much do you value how many minutes of time a pedestrian are saved? And they say, oh, that's 70p a minute. And you start to see where the problems come in. So priorities, what's our role? What's our job in terms of changing these kinds of decision-making systems? That's important. And then the other one is something everyone in this room will be familiar with, the implementation gap. We have solutions. We often have the right strategies. We often have the right policies, but they just don't get put into practice. And some of this is due to the cost of everything's going up. If you're a local government, all your costs are going up. You're being asked to do more and more. The funding you receive is going down. I think that's almost everywhere in the world, apart from places like Luxembourg. This gap, the implementation gap, is not shrinking, it's actually getting bigger. So people are thinking, we need a new way to do things. Not only do we need new things, new solutions, but we need new ways of putting these solutions into practice. And I've just thrown this in here as the kind of one of the new ways of doing things that's currently gaining traction in the European realm, this emergence of so-called mission-based governance. Is this familiar to people? Has everyone heard of mission-based governance? The idea that we need to reorient governance systems around achieving big societal goals, so everyone's pulling in a particular direction. So the United Nations, they're adopting a mission-based approach for addressing climate change, and we have organizations like the Mission Urban Transitions on the right here. It's becoming a big deal. We need new ways of doing things too. But how do we get them? How do we find these new ways? And this, for me, is really what explains the explosion of interest in and practice of experimentation over the last maybe 15 years. We have a lot of problems at the top here. Climate, health, economic crisis, we could list many crises. There are lots. We actually have more and more models of how change might happen. Innovation management, environmental adaptation, adaptive governance, transition management, maybe even mission governance could be added in. And we have some fairly good ideas about what we're trying to achieve, whether it's resilience or sustainability, inclusive growth, new forms of governance. But there's this awkward bit in the middle where someone, in reality, in practice, on the ground, has to do something new. And that more and more increasingly is framed through this idea of experimentation. Let's try something different to see if it works. A few models of experimentation are out there. I'll talk through a few that I've been involved in. So one of the larger models that I think has ever been attempted has been the European Union's Smart Cities and Communities projects. There was a whole series of these funded every year between 2014 and 2017. They were extremely large scale, so most of them were funded to the tune of 30 or 40 million euros each. They involved 3 or 4 cities deploying a whole range of different kinds of solutions, often technological, sometimes social and technological, sometimes nature-based, and then monitoring them in some way to figure out whether they work, providing robust evidence about the benefits, the whole range of benefits, that would then inform their broader adoption and uptake. And the model they used for that was they'd have follower cities. So down the bottom, they talked about demonstration. Then it was all about impact assessment. And then you had the kind of insultingly termed follower cities who apparently had similar problems and would adopt these solutions if you could show they generated enough benefits and worked. And this was the kind of framework into which all of these projects had to fit. Ours ended up with about 6 cities, 30 demonstrations across what ended up being 6 years. It was enormous, and we were only one project of however many are on there. By my reckoning, the EU invested well over €250 million in this program, which must make it the largest urban research and innovation program ever. The problem was it didn't quite do what they wanted. It didn't actually replicate these solutions. They didn't scale up. They weren't implemented more widely. And this, for me, was because it was based on a very kind of market-based model of change, if you like. It saw the solutions as products, and if you could show the products had benefits, then other customers would buy the products. And over time, you'd have more of these solutions deployed. But it didn't work out like this, because it turns out that local authorities, cities, municipalities, councils aren't really consumers. They're not really customers who are looking for solutions off the shelf. And another project we did kind of got me thinking about, well, how do ideas actually travel? Would anyone like to guess where this is? Shout loud. The Netherlands? No, that is an excellent guess, though. Manchester. Yeah, it is. It's Manchester. So we were involved in a project looking at sustainable transport, particularly cycling, in Manchester, and it was part of a broader effort to improve cycling infrastructure on some of the main roads in Manchester. And this eventually got put in. It's anyone familiar with sustainable transport? This is a floating bus stop. So it's called floating because the cycle lane goes behind it. It has the advantage that bikes and cyclists don't get squashed by buses pulling into the bus stop. It has the disadvantage that pedestrians have to cross the cycle lane to get to the bus stop. These things have been common practice in Sweden, the Netherlands, since the late 70s. They've been doing this for about 50 years. In the UK, this is cutting-edge urban innovation, right here. This is as good as it gets. This is leading. And the amount of effort it took to get this into place was unbelievable. We actually had transport planners from the Netherlands flown over and walked along the road with the planners, the highways people from our city council, with tape measures, measuring it, saying, yes, it will fit. Because they said, no, there's no way this will fit. And then they eventually agreed to install 2. This was one of the first ones. There's one on the other side of the street, because they didn't think it would work. They thought it would be a disaster. They thought all these bikes would be hitting the pedestrians. And this is unacceptable. Cyclists, there are many cyclists getting killed every year on this road because it leads to the student area. There's hundreds of buses an hour. But cyclists getting killed by buses is fine. That's the status quo. The thing we're changing to might mean cyclists hit pedestrians. Oh, So they installed 2, and we said, we'll monitor it and see what happens. We'll actually talk to the bus drivers, see how they like it, talk to the people, the pedestrians, talk to the cyclists, monitor for collisions. And the tweak was this kind of mini pedestrian crossing here that got put in. You don't find them in Sweden or Holland. And at that point, they were happy to roll this out, and we now have a number of them across Manchester. But this is where the market-based model doesn't work too well in terms of upscaling and replicating solutions. Everyone has to be articulated into the specificities of a place. And it's this which really got us. I was working at a time with Andrew Carvenan, who's now at Lund, got us really thinking about the important thing here is learning. Cities have to learn what works there. They have to learn whether things will work. And we got interested in the idea of living labs as these kind of institutionally bounded places where you could make some kind of intervention. But the important bit was you do it in a way so that you could learn something about whether it will work. And so this idea of experimenting, monitoring, and then learning became important. And anyway, we decided foolishly that we should do some big project on this because we discovered the answer to urban transformation. And so we were working with colleagues from Brussels mainly, and we came up with a project called Looper. And it was funded through JPI Urban Europe, and they'd funded one round of projects on urban living labs earlier, in about 2013 maybe. And those projects had really focused on co-producing scenarios, visions, plans with communities, but they'd struggled within 3 years to actually implement anything and see whether they worked and collect evidence on whether they worked. So we thought, let's try and do a project that will focus on implementation and then learning and tweaking those solutions once they've been implemented, all in 3 years again. So we came up with a Looper project. It was based upon 3 elements. There was a model of change, a toolkit, which was a kind of attempt to be more rigorous in terms of how you work with communities, collect data, collect their interests and desires. And then we did it across 3 places, Verona, Brussels, Manchester. But in each of those cities, we worked in an area that was quite similar, socioeconomically deprived, fairly urban, quite central in the city, and with lots of traffic. The model we came up with, and I think lots of us work with this kind of idea in various ways, was identifying the problem together, co-produce the problem, what is the problem, co-design solutions, put them into practice. I guess the interesting bit here is towards the end of the loop, and then monitor how they work in reality. This idea that they can be adapted is really important. So the ambitious bit was really this bit, number 3. Can we actually get something done? And if you're interested in the detail of this, my colleague Joe Revetz has written about this at length in his Deeper City book. The toolkit was varied. We did a lot of monitoring with citizens, put sensors in their hands, especially around air quality. We used a lot of digital visualization techniques, but we did a lot of the traditional stuff as well, the offline, getting people around a table with maps and Post-its and so on. And the real advantage of that for me was those different techniques actually engage different types of stakeholders. If you just do the offline stuff like we traditionally do, you'll get a certain groups will come and engage with that. The technology was really good for getting men, especially older men. They like the sensors. Younger men, they like the online stuff. And these groups are not people they're not part of community groups, community organizations. No, they're not going to come and have a cup of tea and a biscuit with you. So that was quite interesting. Then we did some co-design. We used a multi-actor, multi-criteria analysis method to evaluate the options. Someone, I think, mentioned already this morning the idea of conflict in these processes. How do you handle it if different people have different views, ideas, wishes for how they'd like things to go? So we tried to bring some kind of transparency and rigor to that. And then, of course, we wanted to implement and monitor these things as well. So we were counting traffic, we were counting pedestrians, we were monitoring air quality, and noise and a few other things. Shock horror, the things that came out, and this was in our lab in Manchester, but they were similar across them all, related to things like air quality, too much traffic, noise, safety, wanting the environment to be greener, and some transport issues. We did our best to enable change through this project. So this one down here, get the system in the room. There's an old saying that if you want to change the system, you need to get the system in the room. And we thought we did a really good job of this because we'd been working with partners in the City Council on various projects for maybe 6 or 7 years before this. And we actually they had money, they had budget in the project. We had a highways planner seconded to us who was with us through the whole process and was helping design treatments to the main road that was going through the area. We had councillors saying, yes, we've been trying to improve this road for years. We really felt like we'd done a good job. And we came up with a number of solutions. We tried a lot of things out. There were street closures, street art, some kind of small greening initiatives as well. And we were responsive to the community's problems and deployed sensors at places they were worried. So there was a big problem at a school, outside a school with no crossings. So there was air quality and traffic sensors there. We had noise sensors at other places as well. And the data was really quite powerful in showing the level of the problem. But did we manage to get the treatment to the road put in? We absolutely did not. It came out very late in the day that this was what's called a blue light route, which means it's a priority route for emergency vehicles, ambulances, police cars. This was entirely beyond the remit of the highways department, and seemingly entirely outside of the knowledge of any of our stakeholders. So we failed in that sense. So my reflections on it, I guess, were some good. The project did leave a legacy. There's been lots of follow-on work. There is capacity in that neighborhood now. They are actively petitioning the council for various improvements to their environment. A lot of work has been done subsequently with the schools around air quality, and this is a picture that was produced by one of the children in the local school. And we got a follow-on project to carry on monitoring and do more in-depth monitoring and set up an open access real-time environmental data hub. So trying to put the evidence in the hands of the communities to try and force the city council into making changes. And the neighborhood officers who were involved in the group have shared this, and they're now using it in other neighborhoods, and other neighborhood officers are using this, so there's some evidence that there's been transformed governance on the ground. So those are the good bits. The less good bit, there wasn't just one community. There was, it's a mixed area, but there was a large Chinese community who we just never managed to engage at all. That felt like a major oversight. The co-creation was hugely resource intensive. It was a very well-funded project, and I think we still could have done a better job. The implementation is even harder. Most of the things we implemented were actually on private property, because people had control over that and would do things themselves. And the final one is this struggle around wider constraints. You can try something out in one small place, but if the broader context, there's a culture of car driving, or the mayor of the city is not committed to reducing car use, then you're going to struggle to really make any change at a very local level. And so that was a kind of example of trying to work this through on the ground, and why implementation is so hard. And we really did give it a good go in that project. And this kind of led me to rethink this whole idea of transformation and implementation a bit. And I was reading in Frank Gill's most recent book, one of his conclusions at the end, and it's a review of sustainability transitions, the last 20 years. He doesn't pull his punches. He says there's limited empirical evidence of any deeper changes. And these would be the deeper changes, the transformations that people like us have been working on, advocating for, doing projects with people to try and make happen for a long time now. So that's kind of a little bit depressing, but makes me think maybe we need to start rethinking a little bit what we mean by transformation, how we talk about it, who's transforming, what's transforming, how is it transforming. And there's lots of reasons why I think these deep systemic transformations are tricky. The pilot paradox. You try things out, they work, but they don't scale up. Structural constraints, they don't scale up because it's hard to change market economies, national regulations, capital markets, and so on. Cultural fit, do people even want them? It's very hard for us to change or reverse decades of marketing telling you should have a car if you want to be perceived as a successful person. So how can we rethink? And one thing that came out of that big EU Smart Cities project that was really positive was working with the cities on the impact assessment, which was the bit we were responsible for. They started telling us that we were measuring the wrong things. They said, this isn't about carbon dioxide savings. This isn't about, I don't know, more citizens becoming connected. What's really about here is how we're doing things. And a lot of them used the word learning, face-to-face sharing. A lot of them said, we know all this technology works. We don't need any more projects on, let's see if a solar panel is good on a housing association building. And they were talking about processes, a deep examination of our processes. I was looking at this. We did this project with a psychologist from CVUT in Prague, and they were really helpful because they started talking about, well, these experiments, the people involved are experiencing the experiments, and the experiences, they're learning from the experiences, and the experiences are changing them. And then they're going back to their organizations and saying, let's do things differently. I've been transformed. How can we do more of this? How can we do this differently? And so we started talking about maybe learning is the major outcome from these experiments, but not necessarily learning whether a bike share scheme is going to save you carbon. Learning about how you actually work together, how a municipality might need to change to be able to enable the kinds of smaller scale, more adaptive solutions to take hold. So individuals were definitely learning. They told us this. How do we capture it? Well, we started capturing it in that project in our spare time, because there was certainly no budget in the project to capture it. And when we raised it with our project officer at the EU, they kind of laughed at us and said, oh no, we expect people to learn anyway. That should just happen. And it's like, well, that doesn't just happen. And then the final point, the really important one, how can we embed that learning and make it actually add up and outlast the project? We came up with this idea of process learning, so the way in which learning can subsequently inform the changes of processes in organizations. So moving from the kind of experiments, projects, co-creation, whatever they are on the left, but some kind of direct experiences that then become social learning together and then somehow become embedded in changes in organizations. We were looking at municipalities. Those were the people we were talking to. But this could be any organization. And then how that then over time leads to a transformation, both in a more psychological and social sense of how people practice what they do, but also structural. So it can be boring things like standards, policies, norms, processes, guidelines, job descriptions, incentive structures. And that was quite an important, I would say the most important outcome of our involvement in that extremely expensive project was hearing firsthand from the cities, the practitioners, that this was actually the bit that mattered to them and they felt was useful. So there's something here around what are we changing? Transformation, the danger is it's always abstracted. We're transforming something else, someone else, somewhere else. No, actually transformation starts with people. It starts with transforming people. We probably also don't pay enough attention to this bit down here, the reconfiguration of organizations. Loads of people like researching this because it's cool, they're interesting, you get to go to funky places. Loads of people like this because it's there, you can take nice pictures of it, it's obvious. There's actually not many people talking about this because it's messier, more complex. You have to engage with public administration literature, which is not the most exciting. But I think that's where we need to be thinking much more about transforming. A couple of examples, I guess, as a kind of wrap-up, some concrete examples. Leipzig, who were part of the project, Stavanger, who were part of the project, they took their learning and they said, what we have learned is that there's too many people trying to reinvent the wheel. They created a smart city office, adjunct to the mayor's office, where any procurement decisions above a certain value came through that office. So they could say simple things like, you're buying exactly the same thing for waste management as these people are buying for traffic light management. Let's buy the same one. Glasgow and Barcelona. Barcelona famously, Glasgow less so, set up dedicated client units within their municipality. So anyone who wants to sell a solution to these cities has to go through the client unit, and they have to show how that solution addresses one of the stated needs of the city. So these client units have got long lists of what different parts of the city actually need, whether it's the fire service, education. Hell, there is a long list of things that cities need help with. I'll skip to Eindhoven. This was a really interesting one, where they actually ended up restructuring their planning department. So they got rid of the silos of waste, transport, and so on, and just restructured around programming, design, and execution, which is really fascinating. So the same officers could be on the street reporting fly tipping, issuing parking tickets, and checking in on vulnerable citizens to check they were all right. Really interesting integration. This is an idea that has got a bit more traction now. So there's another EU project called CRAFT, Creating Actionable Futures, which has really been thinking about the role of more cultural, creative methods in capacity building and learning, specifically with cities. So I think in the CRAFT network, we have about 70 cities from across Europe. And we've been thinking about how you create shared transformative experiences, how you share them, how that translates into changes to organizational cultures and structures and processes. And I find this really interesting. This pushes us towards working with creative sector, thinking about culture and indeed different cultures and ways into different cultures. In terms of rethinking transformation, I think it's an interesting one. And I guess the final point I'd make is probably quite a simple one, and it involves how different groups in cities are networked and whether they're networked together. So what I saw in places that were doing interesting things repeatedly without a public subsidy, i.e. research funding of some kind, was they had groups within organizations that were well networked, closely networked, and groups across organizations that were closely networked. So to give you an example, there were some biobuses that were deployed in Norway, in Stavanger, that actually were adopted in a couple of other cities. And it was off the back of an event where they actually brought fleet managers and mechanics from those cities to talk to the fleet managers and mechanics in the Stavanger bus company. They weren't talking to us or the project managers in the municipalities. They were talking to their peers who actually have to do this stuff on the ground. And this is, again, another challenge with the implementation gap. Innovation is done by project managers and innovation teams. It's not done by the people who actually replace the light bulbs or mow the grass. And the places it's done best are the places that somehow tie those people into the innovation network. And so you start to think about urban learning more generally. Maybe we need to think about it in more of a neural kind of imaginary way. One of the pieces of work we did has started to make me think that it's not replication, it's more like propagation. You might have a solution here, solution A. Someone involved with this maybe changes job, moves to another city, says, hey, we did A. We've got a similar problem in my new city. We'll do A, but it's a bit different here. It needs to have a little crossing so pedestrians can get to the bus stop. It's A+. Some other people might come on a study trip from a bigger city to visit A, and they'll say, yeah, actually, we could do a big A in our city. And then someone might leave that city and go and work somewhere else and say, A could be so much better. It's become B. And I'll give you one example of that struck me from some work we did when I was in Lund with Malmö. This picture is of the Western Harbour area of Malmö. Anyone been there? The Västra Hamnet? So that's usual story. Harbour became derelict. Massive regeneration project, mixed use, but lots of residential, lots of housing in there. And you can see, I mean, you walk around, it's lovely in Scandinavian. Lots of water, nature, small walkways, attractive, varied architecture, a really nice urban environment. And we were interested here in where they'd got their ideas. Where did the inspiration for this come from? Where had they learnt from? And the answer we got was this. Anyone know where this is? You get real bonus marks if you get this. Bruges. Oh, no, that's a good guess. No, not Bruges. Nope. You're closer. It is the UK. This is Bourton-on-the-Water, which is a small, pretty village in the Cotswolds. They had the team who'd been involved with designing the Western Harbour had taken a study tour to the Cotswolds to look at how water could be integrated into a residential setting. Now, blow me away. I love Scandinavian planning and architecture and design, and when they said they learnt from somewhere in the UK, I was absolutely staggered. But when you talk to cities about how they learn, where they get their ideas, this is absolutely normal. Not best practice reports. Yet no one ever says, I was inspired by a best practice report I found on the internet. No one ever says that. And yet what do we spend our time writing? So I do wonder whether we need to start rethinking what we're doing. And that leads me basically to the final slide. When we're talking about transformation and getting away from the idea that it's something someone else has to do, some other organization, universities, God help us, need to transform as well. This up here, we think we have no money in universities. We actually have enormous resources. I did a piece of work with a team in the teaching and learning unit at our university about if we could get our students doing maybe even a quarter of their coursework on applied sustainability problems, preferably problems that are set by other organizations. You know, they all need evidence reviews or case study reviews or information about potential clients or partners. You know how it is in this sector. Sustainability organizations, local government, they've got very little resource. What if we could get a quarter of our students doing coursework that related to that in Manchester? And then I looked at some of John Goddard's projections for how many students there'll be globally by 2030. And I did some maths. And if we could get every student in the world spending 25% of their coursework working on something that might be useful, that yields 5 million years of effort globally per year. What can you do with 5 million years of effort? The other thing universities have is continuity. We tend to stay in our jobs far longer than people working in almost any other organizations, but certainly in local government or NGOs. When it comes to, we're often writing, criticize, cities are repeating the wheel, they're reinventing the same thing, they should learn from here, there, and everywhere. That's our job. That's our job, to be the collective memory, if you like, of the city region. We should be doing that. We're ideally placed. Universities don't tend to go bust, and staff tend to stick around for ages. We could be doing that. And these are questions more and more people are asking. In Julia Wittmeyer and Dirk Laurbach's latest paper, they asked the question, what does a transformative university look like? That is a great question. I don't think we have the answer for that. What I've seen coming here and talking to people at the IOER is that seems like something that's moving towards this. How can researchers perform a transformative role? The final anecdote I'll leave you with is from a project a great PhD student I had recently, Joe Chambers, was looking at urban innovation in East Africa. And this example is from Nairobi. It's from Kibera, which is famously one of the largest informal settlements in the world. And the problem is drinking water. There's obviously no running water, so people have to go to these water tanks. They often have to walk a while to get there, they then have to queue up a while, and then often the water runs out before they get to the front of the queue. They have to walk to another one. This has all of those well-known development impacts around people, often women and children, spending time doing this rather than in education or working. And one of the companies he worked with quite closely had come up with a sensor, IoT sensor, that you put in the water tank. People can download an app on their phone, and it tells them how much water is in the water tank. So they've got some idea where there's lots of water, where there isn't much water. It's a great example. Why was this happening in Kibera? Well, it turns out Nairobi University has an excellent undergraduate course in electrical engineering with lots of electives in communications, Internet of Things devices. And this is essentially enabling all kinds of really interesting, useful solutions in what is arguably the largest slum settlement on the planet. And that's a university doing that. So I think universities, we already are and can do this. We just need to give some thought to how we can do more of it quicker. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.